If you wanted to move £2.5 million across England in 1963, you didn't use an armored convoy. You didn't use a private militia or a high-security vault. You put it in a canvas bag. You put that bag in a wooden carriage. And you sent it hurtling through the dark on a schedule anyone with a watch could track. The British establishment didn't protect its wealth with steel, it protected it with a feeling. The feeling that some things were simply unthinkable. It was unthinkable to stop the Royal Mail. It was unthinkable to challenge the heartbeat of the railway. Until, on a damp August night in Buckinghamshire, 16 men decided that the unthinkable was actually quite simple. Far away at first, a low rhythmic percussion against the rails growing steadily louder, the sound of something very large moving very fast through the darkness, a train, 12 carriages. Long, pulled by a single diesel locomotive, hurtling south from Glasgow toward London at over 80 miles an hour. On board, 72 postal workers sorting letters and packages in the half-light, a driver named Jack Mills doing what he had done 1,000 times before, watching the signals, keeping the pace, trusting that the rails ahead were clear. And somewhere in the second carriage from the front, stacked in canvas bags, sorted and bundled. And waiting, £2.5 million in used banknotes. Waiting, though no one on that train yet knew it, to be stolen. Welcome to Soft Echoes of History. This is a place for the curious mind, the tired soul. If this is your first time here, I am genuinely glad you found us. This channel exists for one reason only, to tell true stories well, at the pace they deserve, with the kind of attention that history rarely gets and always deserves. If you'd like to be here for the next one, and there is always a next one, the subscribe button is just below this video. It costs you nothing, but for a small channel like this one, it means more than I can easily say. Now, let us begin. To understand the Great Train Robbery, you have to understand the world it was born into. Britain in the early 1960s was a country still finding itself after the long shadow of the Second World War. Rationing had only ended in 1954. The bomb sites in London were still being cleared. And yet something new was stirring. Rock and roll had arrived from America. Fashion was changing. Young people who had grown up in austerity were beginning to push back against it, noisily, colorfully, in ways that made their parents deeply uncomfortable. It was a moment of contradiction. The old rules were loosening, but the new ones hadn't quite arrived yet. And in that space between, in the gap between what was permitted and what was possible, a certain kind of man found opportunities. Bruce Reynolds was 31 years old in 1962, and he was, by any reasonable measure, already a successful criminal. He had grown up in London, Putney first, then Gants Hill, the only child of a father who worked on the Ford assembly line at Dagenham. His mother had died when he was 4 years old. It was not, by any measure, an easy childhood, and Reynolds had found his way into crime early, moving through petty theft and breaking and entering before graduating to more sophisticated operations. He was not a violent man. That is worth saying clearly. Reynolds had a code, an old-fashioned, almost theatrical sense of how things ought to be done. No guns, no unnecessary harm. The robbery as a kind of art form, if art forms could be conducted in balaclavas. He read voraciously. He loved jazz. He had a quiet, watchful intelligence that made people trust him, and an ambition so immense that even his friends sometimes found it slightly alarming. By 1962, Reynolds had already attempted to rob a mail train once. At Swindon, his gang had boarded a traveling post office, a train that sorted mail while in motion, and had come away with exactly £700. £700 split between multiple men after months of planning. It was, by any calculation, a failure. But Reynolds had seen something on that train, something that he couldn't stop thinking about. He had seen how the money moved. The British postal system moved cash across the country on its trains. It always had. This was the most practical way to transfer large sums of used notes between banks and financial institutions, not in armored trucks, not with elaborate security arrangements, but in the unremarkable second carriage of a Royal Mail train, tucked in among the parcels and registered letters, moving through the night when no one was watching. The system was called the High-Value Package Carriage, the HVP, and on most nights its contents were modest enough, a few £100,000, perhaps a little more. But Reynolds had a source. He was known only as the Ulsterman. To this day, more than 60 years after the robbery, the true identity of the Ulsterman has never been officially confirmed. He was, by all accounts, a senior security officer within the Royal Mail, a man with detailed knowledge of the system from the inside. A man who knew, weeks in advance, how much money would be on which train on which night, and who had, for reasons that were never fully established, decided to share that information. He had been introduced to two of the men who would eventually carry out the robbery, Gordon Goody and Buster Edwards, through a London solicitor's clerk named Brian Field. And through that introduction, a conversation had taken place that would change the lives of everyone involved. The Ulsterman told them what to watch for. He told them about the bank holidays. He told them that when Scottish banks were closed over a long weekend, the money they normally sent south on a daily basis would accumulate and then travel all at once in a single enormous sum on the next available train. Reynolds listened to all of this. And then he began to plan. A robbery of this scale required people, specific, reliable, capable people, not simply men who were willing to commit a crime. Reynolds knew plenty of those, but men with particular skills, particular temperaments. He began with his own circle. Gordon Goody was the first, a tall, striking man who worked of all things as a hairdresser in London, and had been supplementing his income with robbery for years. Goody was sharp, precise, and as particular about the details of an operation as Reynolds himself. He would become, in effect, Reynolds's second in command. Then there was Buster Edwards, a former boxer who had transitioned into nightclub ownership and then, almost inevitably it seemed, into armed robbery. Edwards had energy and nerve, and a gift for holding men together under pressure. He brought his own crew with him. Charlie Wilson, quiet, reliable, the man they called the Silent One. Wilson had the kind of stillness that serious criminals often do, the stillness of a man who has learned that talking is usually how you get caught. Roy James was different from the others. He was young and slight, and his main contribution to the gang was not his criminal record but his day job. Roy James was one of the most talented racing drivers in Britain. Not famous, not yet, but brilliant, a man who could take a vehicle through impossible conditions at speeds that left other drivers stunned. He would be their getaway driver. To supplement Reynolds's crew, they brought in another London gang entirely, the South Coast Raiders. These men were experienced train robbers, which Reynolds crucially was not. Tommy Wisby, Bob Welch, Jim Hussey, three men from southeast London who knew exactly what it meant to stop a moving train and take what was on it. And with them came Roger Corddry, a quiet, methodical man who specialized in one very specific thing: railway signals. Corddry understood the signal systems on British railways in a way that few people outside the industry did. He could read them, manipulate them, make them say whatever he needed them to say. He was the man who would stop the train. Then there was Ronnie Biggs. It is one of history's smaller ironies that the man who would become the most famous of all the great train robbers was also, objectively, the one who contributed least to the actual operation. Biggs was a small-time thief whom Reynolds had met in prison, a personable, easy-going man without Goody's precision or Wilson's stillness or James's particular brilliance. He had one job, one single contribution to the most ambitious robbery in British history. He was supposed to know a retired train driver. This matters, and we'll come back to it, because the retired train driver, a man the gang would simply call Pop, was going to be essential. After the robbery stopped the train, someone needed to drive it forward, someone who knew how to operate a locomotive. And Reynolds's plan had always accounted for this. Someone who knew trains, someone who could move the engine. Biggs said he could find that person. Reynolds trusted him. By the spring of 1963, the gang was assembled, 16 men in total, including Biggs and the train driver. Men from different parts of London, different backgrounds, different levels of experience. Some had known each other for years, others were meeting properly for the first time. Together, they represented something that had never quite existed before in British criminal history, a task force. Not a gang in the old sense, loyal to a neighborhood or a single leader, but a collection of specialists assembled for a single enormous job, like a film crew, Reynolds sometimes thought, brought together to make one particular picture, then dispersed. The job just happened to involve stealing £2.5 million. Reynolds understood more than most men in his position that the difference between a successful robbery and a catastrophic one was almost never the robbery itself. It was the preparation. He had spent time thinking through every detail, every contingency, every point at which the plan could fracture. The train was the easy part, in a sense. It ran on rails, it stopped at signals, it couldn't deviate. If you controlled the signal, you controlled the train. The hard part was everything else. They needed a base, somewhere large enough to accommodate 16 men and several vehicles, somewhere isolated enough that no one would notice the comings and goings. Somewhere within a reasonable drive of the robbery site, but not so close that a search of the area would find them immediately. The solution came through a man named John Weeder, a solicitor who had connections in the property world. A farmhouse was identified in rural Buckinghamshire, Leatherslade Farm set back from the road, surrounded by fields, with outbuildings large enough to house the Army lorry and Land Rovers they would need. It was rented under an assumed name, or it was supposed to be. This detail, seemingly small, maddeningly significant, would eventually contribute to the gang's undoing. The purchase had been handled carelessly, through a known associate, under a name that could be traced. But in the spring and summer of 1963, Leatherslade Farm seemed perfect. The route was carefully studied. The section of track between Leighton Buzzard and Cheddington in Buckinghamshire was chosen for several reasons. It was far enough from London that police response time would be significant. There was a bridge, Bridego Bridge, close enough to the planned stopping point that the loaded lorry could be brought underneath to receive the money bags. And the track ran along an embankment at Sears Crossing, which meant the stolen money could be passed from the carriage, down the embankment, and into the waiting vehicles with some efficiency. Roger Corddry visited the site multiple times. He studied the signal gantry at Sears Crossing. He understood exactly how to stop the train there, and keep it stopped long enough for the work to be done. One member of the gang spent weeks visiting railway stations, befriending staff, riding in locomotive cabs as a supposed enthusiast, learning everything he could about how these trains actually worked. It was a patient, methodical kind of deception, the kind that required a certain temperament, the ability to be interested without showing too much interest. The Ulstermen confirmed what they needed to know about the timing. The Scottish bank holiday weekend would be the first week of August 1963. The money would accumulate over those days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and then travel south on Tuesday night, arriving in London in the early hours of Wednesday morning. Reynolds moved the date slightly. He wanted Thursday the 8th of August. The bank holiday was on the 5th. By the 8th, the delayed shipment would still be enormous, but the timing felt better, more reliable. The mail sorting on the train would be in full swing. The staff settled into their rhythms. Vehicles were sourced, 3 Land Rovers and an Army lorry, painted to look like military property, a detail that would allow them to move through the countryside without attracting attention. Boiler suits were bought, gloves, balaclavas, a radio scanner to monitor police frequencies. Koshas, leather truncheons of the kind used by security personnel, in case resistance needed to be overcome. No firearms. Reynolds was absolute on this point. Firearms changed the nature of a crime. They attracted a different kind of attention, a different kind of sentence, a different kind of man. This operation would be done without guns. The planning took months, and by the time July arrived, Reynolds believed they were ready. There was one thing that made him slightly uneasy. Pop, the retired train driver that Biggs had recruited. Reynolds had not been able to verify, to his own satisfaction, exactly what kind of trains this man had driven, what kind of locomotives he was familiar with, whether the engine of the Up Special, a large modern diesel, would be within his abilities. He asked, he was reassured, he moved on. It was the one detail he didn't check closely enough. It is worth stepping back for a moment from the farmhouse and the signal gantry and the counting of Land Rovers to consider what England looked like in the summer of 1963. The Beatles had released their first album, Please Please Me, in March of that year. It had gone to #1 and stayed there for 30 weeks. The country was in the early throes of something that would later be called the British Cultural Revolution, a loosening of manners and expectations and class structures that had governed English life for a very long time. Youth was becoming a different thing. Working class was becoming a different thing. Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister, but only barely. His government was already reeling from the Profumo affair, a scandal involving a cabinet minister, a showgirl, and a Soviet naval attaché that had electrified the newspapers all spring. The establishment, once impregnable, had shown that it could bleed. In this atmosphere, this crackling, transitional, irreverent summer, a gang of South London men planning to steal £2.5 million from a Royal Mail train did not feel entirely out of place. They felt, if anything, like a symptom, like something that the season had made possible. The money they were planning to take was old money, institutional money, the kind of money that moved through official channels in the middle of the night precisely because those channels had always been considered unassailable. The Royal Mail, Her Majesty's train service, the infrastructure of a country that trusted its own systems with the absolute confidence of a nation that had not yet been forced to question them. Reynolds understood this, consciously or not. He had grown up seeing money as something that happened to other people, to the men in good suits who ran the antique shops he had worked in as a cover, to the men in the city offices whose windows he had occasionally looked through during his more modest criminal enterprises. The distance between those men and himself had always felt enormous and fixed and permanent. The train robbery was, among other things, a refusal of that distance. Not a political act. Reynolds was not a political man, but a demonstration to himself and to anyone watching that the gap was not as fixed as it appeared, that the systems were not as impregnable as they seemed, that one well-organized, well-planned, determined effort could reach through the walls of the establishment and take what was on the other side. He was right about that. He was wrong about what came next. On Tuesday, the 6th of August, 1963, the gang members began to make their way to Leatherslade Farm. They came in ones and twos, by different routes as instructed. By the time evening came, 16 men were gathered in a farmhouse in rural Buckinghamshire, eating, waiting, running through the plan one more time. There was, by all accounts, a strange mood in the farm that night, the kind of atmosphere that comes before something enormous, a mixture of tension and excitement, and a flat, deliberate calm that serious men put on over the top of their nerves the way you put on a coat. They waited for confirmation that the money was on its way. The signal came. The Ulsterman had delivered. The haul was going to be even larger than anticipated, not just the deferred Scottish money, but an unusually large shipment by any standards. The sum would later be calculated at £2,631,684. In today's terms, somewhere between 50 and 70 million pounds. At Glasgow Central Station, at 10 minutes to 7 on the evening of Wednesday, the 7th of August, the Up Special Mail train departed on schedule. 12 carriages, a single diesel locomotive, 72 postal workers beginning the long overnight sort, driver Jack Mills at the controls, with his co-driver David Whitby beside him. The train was unremarkable. It looked like every other mail train. No one watching it pull out of Glasgow Central could have known that 16 men were waiting for it in a darkened farmhouse 40 miles north of London. At Leatherslade Farm, the gang slept or tried to. Some couldn't. The hours passed. The vehicles were checked. The equipment was laid out. The route from the farm to Bridego Bridge, 27 miles on quiet country roads, had been driven multiple times and could now be done almost without thinking. Reynolds, by his own later account, did not sleep at all. He lay in the darkness of the farmhouse and ran through the plan again and again and again, looking for the thing he might have missed. He didn't find it, not that night. At 2 in the morning on Thursday, the 8th of August, the gang left Leatherslade Farm. They moved in convoy, the Land Rovers and the lorry making their way through the sleeping Buckinghamshire countryside on roads that were empty at this hour. No other vehicles, no lights in the farmhouses they passed, the world asleep and unaware. They reached the target area before 3. Some of the gang went directly to Bridego Bridge, a modest railway overpass about a mile south of the planned stopping point. This was where the lorry would wait. This was where the money would be unloaded. The others went to Sears Crossing itself. Roger Corddry went to work on the signals. The signal gantry at Sears Crossing had both a green light and a red light. Corddry's task was straightforward in concept, if precise in execution. Cover the green light so that it couldn't be seen by an approaching driver, and activate the red light using an external power source. The signal system drew its power from the railway's own electrical supply. Corddry would bypass this entirely, wiring the red light directly to a cluster of 6-volt batteries. He covered the green light with a glove. He wired in the batteries. The red light came on. The trackside telephone, the means by which a driver, stopping at a signal, would normally contact the signalman to report the problem, had its wires quietly cut. And then the gang waited. The Up Special had been traveling south for over 8 hours. It had passed through Carlisle and Preston and Crewe, through the dark middle of England, at a steady and unremarkable pace. Jack Mills had made this journey hundreds of times. He knew the rhythm of it, the feel of it. He watched the signals and adjusted the speed, and did not think about anything unusual, because there was nothing unusual to think about. It is worth understanding what the Up Special actually was, because it matters for understanding what made it such an extraordinary target. The traveling post office was a Victorian invention that had become one of the quiet wonders of the British railway system. The concept was elegantly simple. Rather than carrying sorted mail from point to point and sorting it at either end, why not sort it en route? A carriage fitted with sorting frames and collection nets could receive mail from line-side bags as the train passed through stations, the bags snatched from posts by mechanical arms at speed, without the train ever stopping, and by the time the service arrived at its destination, the work was done. The Up Special was the longest-running and most prestigious of these services, 12 carriages, 72 staff. A rolling sorting office that processed hundreds of thousands of letters and packages every night, sliding through the darkness while Britain slept. In the second carriage from the front, the high-value package coach, the contents were different. Not letters, not parcels, cash, the used banknotes that moved between Scottish financial institutions and the Bank of England in London, the daily circulatory system of a national economy, flowing south on the overnight train as it had for years, unremarkable and unquestioned. By 1963, the HVP carriage had been redesigned 3 times to improve security: alarms, bars on the windows, reinforced doors. And this was the detail that the Ulsterman had passed on, the detail that made Reynolds's calculations change. The most recent upgraded carriages were currently out of service, being refitted or repaired or simply awaiting allocation. On the night of August 7th, the Up Special was using the older, unmodified reserve carriages. The bars were not there, the alarms were not connected. History turns on details like this, on a carriage being out of service, on a signal gantry that could be wired with a 6-volt battery, on a retired train driver who knew the wrong kind of locomotive. The train passed through Leighton Buzzard at approximately 3 in the morning. A few minutes later, in the darkness ahead, Jack Mills saw a red signal. He brought the train to a halt at Sears Crossing. It was the most normal thing in the world. Trains stopped at red signals. They always had. There was nothing in this moment. The quiet locomotive, the hiss of the brakes, the sudden stillness after hours of motion, to suggest that anything was wrong. David Whitby climbed down from the cab. He walked to the trackside telephone. He lifted the receiver. There was nothing. The line was dead. Whitby looked around at the empty embankment, the August night warm and still, the fields stretching away on both sides, everything quiet. He turned back toward the train. And the men were already there. They came from the embankment on both sides, dark figures in boiler suits and balaclavas, moving quickly, purposefully, without hesitation. Whitby was grabbed before he could react. He was pushed and held and told not to make a sound, and he didn't. He was not badly hurt, but he was firmly, completely under their control. In the locomotive cab, Jack Mills became aware of figures moving outside the window. He had a second, perhaps 2, to understand what was happening. A man climbed in through the cab door from behind. Mills tried to resist, Later accounts differ on exactly how what happened next unfolded, but the outcome is not in dispute. Mills was struck across the head by a cosh, by a blunt instrument of some kind. Struck hard enough to render him semi-conscious, bleeding, unable to fight back. He slumped in the driver's seat. The cab was taken. Now came the moment that Reynolds had thought about more than any other. The plan called for the train to be driven forward, approximately 1 mile south along the track, to Bridego Bridge. This was non-negotiable. The embankment at Sears Crossing was too steep to unload the money. The bridge was where the lorry was waiting. The bridge was where this had to happen. Pop, the retired train driver, climbed into the cab. He looked at the controls, and his face changed. The locomotive he was looking at was a Class 40 diesel electric engine, modern, powerful, considerably more complex than the local stopping trains he had driven years ago. The controls were arranged differently. The systems were different. The layout of the cab, the feel of the instruments, he couldn't do it. In all the months of planning, in all the careful preparation, in all the detailed rehearsal, this was the thing that had been assumed rather than checked. This was the thread that Reynolds had pulled at and then left alone. Pop turned to the men around him and said quietly that he couldn't drive this train. For a moment, just a moment, everything balanced on an edge. 16 men and a fortune in banknotes and a ticking clock, and one man who couldn't operate the machine. Then someone made a decision. They would wake the driver. Jack Mills was pulled back to something approaching consciousness. He was told directly and without ambiguity that he was going to move this train 1 mile forward to the bridge, that if he cooperated, no further harm would come to him, that if he didn't. Mills cooperated. Bleeding from the wound on his head, barely able to focus, he reached for the controls he had operated 1,000 times before and brought the up special slowly, carefully, 1 mile down the track. To Bridego Bridge, where the lorry was waiting. The train came to a stop beneath Bridego Bridge at approximately 3:15 in the morning. The bridge was a modest thing, a stone arch carrying a country road over the railway line. Below it, the lorry was parked on the access track that ran alongside the embankment. The bank here was shallower, manageable. And now the gang went to work. Most of the 16 men moved to the second carriage, the high-value package coach. The doors were forced. Inside, postal workers who had been sorting mail through the night found themselves confronted by figures in boiler suits, ordered to move to one end of the carriage and stay there. To their considerable credit, the postal staff complied without provoking any further violence. They were frightened, and they were outnumbered, and they did the sensible thing. The bags were there, canvas mail bags, each one heavy with bundled banknotes, stacked in the carriage in their dozens. A human chain formed. From the carriage, down the embankment to the waiting lorry, the bags passed from hand to hand in the darkness. 120 bags in total, each one weighed roughly 40 pounds. The total weight of the cash was somewhere around 2.5 tons. They moved it all in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Not because they were panicking, not because they were rushing carelessly, but because they had thought about this, practiced this, understood exactly how many men you needed in a chain and exactly how long it would take, and then they had executed it with the kind of precision that comes from preparation so thorough it becomes automatic. Before they left, one of the gang turned to the postal workers in the carriage. "Stay where you are," he said. "Do not raise the alarm for 30 minutes." It was, in retrospect, an interesting instruction. Not because the postal workers were likely to disobey, they weren't, but because of what it revealed about the gang's thinking. 30 minutes was the time they calculated they needed to reach Leatherslade Farm. If the workers waited 30 minutes, the police response would begin too late to intercept them. The lorry and the Land Rovers pulled away from Bridego Bridge. The train sat motionless on the track in the August darkness, its driver bleeding in the cab, its second carriage emptied, £2.5 million heading north toward a farmhouse in Buckinghamshire. Somewhere in the 10 carriages at the rear, still sitting at Sears Crossing where they had been uncoupled, postal workers continued sorting mail, completely unaware that anything had happened at all. The vehicles arrived at Leatherslade Farm in the early hours of the morning. The men unloaded the bags into the farmhouse, and then they began to count. It is difficult to fully imagine what it must have felt like in that farmhouse in those hours. 16 men surrounded by more money than most of them had ever seen, more money than most of them had ever imagined seeing. The bags were opened, the bundles were stacked, the counting went on and on, the numbers climbing past what had been expected, past what had seemed possible. £2.5 million. More. At some point, someone produced a Monopoly board. It is one of those details that seems almost too perfect to be real, and yet it is confirmed by multiple sources etched into the record of this event with the permanence of something that cannot be invented. 15 criminals, sitting in a farmhouse surrounded by real money so abundant it could have bought a street of houses, playing a board game with properties and rent and a little metal top hat, using the stolen notes as their play money. Later, the fingerprints on that Monopoly board would help convict several of them. But that was still weeks away. For now, there was only the extraordinary, improbable, almost dreamlike present, the farm, the money. The August morning breaking outside the windows, the English countryside turning gold in the early light, entirely indifferent to what had happened in the darkness. The plan had been to stay at Leatherslade Farm for 2 weeks, long enough for the immediate search to lose momentum. Long enough for the dragnet to move on to other locations. The farm had been stocked with food and supplies. There was nothing to do but wait and count and be patient and let time do the work. Reynolds was cautious by nature. He understood that patience was the most important quality a criminal could have in the days after an operation. The men who got caught were the men who moved too soon. But the days that followed were not easy. The news was everywhere. Every radio broadcast, every newspaper, led with the robbery. The scale of it, the sheer audacity, the precision, the enormous sum involved, had captured the country's attention in a way that few crimes ever had. Scotland Yard had dispatched its best men. The flying squad, the elite robbery investigation unit, was at full stretch. And then, low over the farmhouse, RAF training aircraft began to appear. They were on routine exercises, nothing more, but the men at the farm couldn't know that, they couldn't ask. They could only watch the aircraft pass overhead and wonder if they had been found, and feel the paranoia tightening. A radio broadcast mentioned that police were searching farmhouses in Buckinghamshire. The plan began to unravel. The gang had agreed that if they needed to leave early, the farm would be cleaned. Thoroughly, professionally cleaned. Every surface wiped, every fingerprint removed, every trace of their presence eliminated. and then a trusted associate would come back and burn it to the ground. They made the decision to leave on Friday the 9th, 2 days earlier than planned. They cleaned what they could, they wiped surfaces, they tried to be thorough. They were not thorough enough. The man they had hired to burn the farm down, the one who would come back after them and eliminate everything, didn't come. For reasons that have never been fully established, he simply didn't return to Leatherslade Farm. And so it sat untouched, full of evidence. On the morning of Tuesday, the 13th of August, 5 days after the robbery, a herdsman named John Maris was moving cattle near the farm. He noticed things: a vehicle he hadn't seen before, curtains drawn at unusual times, a general sense that the place had recently been occupied by people who didn't want to be noticed. He called the police. A constable named John Woolley was the first to arrive at Leatherslade Farm. He found the doors unlocked, he pushed them open. And inside, he found everything. Half-eaten food on the kitchen table, sleeping bags upstairs, a military lorry in the outbuildings, still painted in its camouflage colors. In the cellar, banknote wrappers, post office sacks, registered mail packages, fragments of evidence so abundant and so clearly indicative that there could be no doubt whatsoever about what had happened here. And fingerprints. On the cans in the kitchen, on the windows, on the sleeping bags, on the vehicles, on the ketchup bottle. On the Monopoly board, pressed into the cardboard with the unconscious confidence of men who had believed, wrongly, fatally, that they were untouchable. The investigation, which had been moving in circles, suddenly had a center. The man leading the hunt for the Great Train Robbers was a detective named Tommy Butler. He was a singular figure in the Metropolitan Police, obsessive, meticulous, and so deeply committed to the pursuit of criminals that he had never married, never, by many accounts, developed much of a life outside the job. He worked 18-hour days, he went home to sleep and came back. He kept his own counsel and shared almost nothing with his colleagues, which occasionally frustrated the investigation, but also meant that the information he had was never leaked. Butler had come up through the flying squad. He understood the criminal underworld of London in the way that only men who have spent decades inside it professionally can understand it, not as an abstraction, but as a living network of relationships and obligations and old debts. He knew who knew who. He knew which faces connected to which faces. When the fingerprints from Leatherslade Farm were matched against police records, they produced names, known names, South London names, men Butler had encountered before. Within days of the farm's discovery, the flying squad had a list. Roger Corddry was the first arrested on the 22nd of August, less than 2 weeks after the robbery. He was stopped in Bournemouth, carrying a large quantity of cash. He eventually pleaded guilty and cooperated partially with the investigation. Charlie Wilson was arrested on the 22nd of August. Jimmy White and Roy James were picked up in the weeks that followed. Ronnie Biggs, whose fingerprints had been found on the ketchup bottle, was arrested on the 4th of September, less than a month after the robbery. One by one, through the autumn of 1963, the gang fell. Gordon Goody was questioned early but released for lack of evidence. He was re-arrested weeks later when new evidence emerged. Brian Field, the solicitor's clerk who had made the original introduction, was charged. His associate Leonard Field, who had no real involvement in the robbery itself, but had been a link in the chain, was also charged. William Boal, who had little to do with the robbery proper, but had been helping Roger Corddry move the money, was swept up in the arrests and charged alongside the principal gang members. He would receive a sentence as severe as the planners, which many observers at the time felt was deeply unjust, a judgment that history has largely endorsed. Bruce Reynolds, Gordon Goody's close associate and the mastermind of the entire operation, was not caught that autumn. He was not caught that winter. He disappeared, first into the network of safe houses that the London underworld maintained, then out of the country entirely. Via Belgium, via Mexico City, where he lived under the assumed name Keith Miller with his wife Frances, renamed Angela, and their young son. For 5 years. Roy James, the racing driver, the one with the extraordinary hands, the man who could take a vehicle through any situation at any speed, was arrested in November 1963. He had been living in London and was tracked down by the flying squad. At the time of his arrest, he attempted to escape across the rooftops and had to be physically restrained. He received a 25-year sentence. After his release, James returned to his first love, motor racing. He competed in various events through the 1980s. Then, in 1993, he shot and wounded his father-in-law and his estranged wife, for which he received a further prison sentence. He died in 1997, aged 62, from a heart condition. Jimmy White was the member of the gang described by those who knew him as having a remarkable ability to be invisible, to blend into any background so completely that he might as well not be there. He had been on the run for a decade before the train robbery, wanted on other charges, and he stayed on the run for 3 years after it. He was finally caught in April 1966 when a friend turned him in. He served 9 years. Gordon Goody served the longest of all those convicted, 12 years of his 25-year sentence. He was released in the mid-1970s and eventually moved to Spain, where he lived quietly for decades, occasionally giving interviews, becoming over time one of the last remaining first-hand sources on what had actually happened at Sears Crossing in August 1963. He died in January 2016. Buster Edwards fled to Mexico with his family to join Reynolds, but Edwards was a different kind of man. He missed England. He missed his family's normal life. The exile, which had seemed like freedom in those first weeks, became something heavier as the months passed. In 1966, he made a decision that most people in his position would never make. He came home. He gave himself up. He served 9 years. After his release, Buster Edwards set up a flower stall outside Waterloo Station in London. This detail has always seemed to carry a particular kind of weight. A man who had once stood under a railway bridge and held £2.5 million in his hands, selling carnations and daffodils a few minutes' walk from one of the city's great railway terminal. He became something of a local celebrity. People who knew the story would come to buy flowers from him just to say they had. In 1988, a film was made about his life called Buster, with Phil Collins in the lead role, and it brought him a fresh wave of attention that he seemed to find simultaneously gratifying and exhausting. He took his own life in November 1994, at the age of 62. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing about him. Other detectives moved on to other cases. The Great Train Robbery receded from the daily front pages, replaced by new events, new outrages. But Butler remained fixed on it, on the men who hadn't yet been caught, on the money that hadn't been found, on the loose ends that troubled his sleep. He tracked Reynolds to Torquay in November of 1968, 5 years and 3 months after the robbery. Reynolds had returned to Britain when his money ran out, and had been living quietly in the Devon seaside town under yet another assumed name. Butler arrived at his door. Reynolds, by his own account, looked at Butler standing there in the morning light and said simply, "C'est la vie." Such is life. The trial of the Great Train robbers took place at Aylesbury Crown Court, beginning in January 1964. It was, at the time, one of the longest and most complex criminal trials in British legal history. The courthouse was not large enough to comfortably accommodate the proceedings. Extra security was installed. The public gallery was full for every session. The press coverage was extraordinary. The defendants arrived each day under heavy escort. Some of them had been held in the special maximum security unit at Durham Prison, a unit built specifically for them, a unit that spoke to how seriously the establishment had taken this robbery and how seriously it intended to respond. The prosecution's case rested largely on the fingerprint evidence from Leatherslade Farm, supplemented by witness testimony and the money that had been recovered in various raids and arrests. The defense arguments were, in many cases, creative. John Daly, Bruce Reynolds' brother-in-law, argued successfully that his fingerprints on the Monopoly board only proved he had played Monopoly with Reynolds at some earlier point, not that he had been at Leatherslade Farm during the robbery. His counsel, Walter Rayburn QC, was persuasive, and the judge directed the jury to acquit. Daly walked free. The others were not so fortunate. On the 8th of April 1964, the sentences were handed down. They were, by any standard, severe. The judge clearly intended them to send a message, not just to these men, but to anyone who might be contemplating something similar. Gordon Goody, 25 years. Charlie Wilson, 25 years. Buster Edwards, 15 years. Tommy Wisby, 25 years. Jim Hussey, 25 years. Bob Welch, 25 years. Roger Cordry, 20 years. Brian Field, 25 years. William Boal, 24 years. And Ronnie Biggs. Ronnie Biggs, who had recruited a train driver who couldn't drive the train, who had played a minor, peripheral role in the actual robbery, who had been swept along by the ambition of men more capable than himself, received 30 years. The total sentences handed down that day amounted to 307 years. The country, reading about it the next morning, reacted with a complicated mixture of feelings. There was satisfaction that justice had been done. There was unease at the scale of the punishment. And there was quietly, persistently, something else, a kind of reluctant admiration for the sheer scale of what these men had pulled off. Something that the newspapers struggled to acknowledge openly, but that was present, unmistakably, in the way they wrote about it. The robbery had been, as one police officer later admitted, brilliantly planned and brilliantly executed. The failure had come not in the crime itself, but in the aftermath, in the Monopoly board, in the ketchup bottle, in the farm that wasn't burned. Crime had not paid, but it had come remarkably, uncomfortably close. If the sentences were intended to close the chapter on the Great Train Robbery, they failed almost immediately. Charlie Wilson was the first. Wilson, known as the Silent Man, the one who never talked, never boasted, never gave anything away, had been assessed as a security risk from the beginning. Police intelligence suggested that the London underworld had formed what they called, with grim humor, an escape committee, a group of associates dedicated to getting Wilson out. On the 12th of August 1964, just 4 months into his 25-year sentence, 3 men came to Winson Green Prison in Birmingham. At 3 in the morning, they scaled the wall. They had the right tools and apparently the right information. The entire escape took less than 3 minutes. Wilson was free. He made his way to Canada, then to the south of Spain, living under assumed identities, moving when he felt the pressure building. Scotland Yard eventually tracked him to a villa outside Montreal, and he was brought back to Britain in 1968. He served the remainder of his sentence and was released. In 1990, Charlie Wilson was shot and killed at his villa in Marbella, Spain. He was 58 years old. The killing was believed to be connected to a dispute within the criminal underworld. The long, dark tale of a life lived on the wrong side of every line. Then there was Biggs. On the 8th of July, 1965, 15 months into his 30-year sentence at Wandsworth Prison, Ronnie Biggs disappeared. The method was theatrical in its simplicity. A rope ladder was thrown over the prison wall. A furniture van was parked outside, its roof modified with a hole through which a man could drop from the wall directly into the vehicle. Biggs climbed the ladder, dropped through the hole, and was driven away before the alarm was raised. He fled to France with his wife Charmian and their children, Hen, to Australia, where the family lived quietly for a while, before Biggs was identified by the tabloid press and had to move again. Then to Brazil, specifically to Rio de Janeiro, where a particular provision of Brazilian law made extradition impossible as long as he had fathered a Brazilian child, which Biggs subsequently did. For more than 3 decades, Ronnie Biggs lived in Rio. He became in that time one of the most famous fugitives in the world, not feared, not despised, but almost celebrated. Journalists flew from London to interview him. Tourists sought him out. He appeared in a film with the Sex Pistols. He gave countless interviews, told his story in a memoir, and lived with a frankness about his past that was almost disarming. Scotland Yard could do nothing. He was beyond their reach, and he knew it, and in the way of a man who has been given an extraordinary reprieve, he made the most of it. In 2001, in declining health, Biggs made the decision to come home. He flew back to Britain of his own free will and was immediately arrested at the airport. He served several more years in prison before being released on compassionate grounds in 2009, by which point he was elderly and seriously ill. He died in December 2013 at the age of 84. A free man. The last surviving member of the gang known to the public was Bob Welch, who died on the 2nd of November 2023. 60 years after the robbery to the month. Of the 2,631,684 pounds stolen from the Up Special Mail train on the 8th of August 1963, only approximately 400,000 pounds was ever recovered by police. The rest, roughly 2 million pounds, which in today's terms represents tens of millions, simply vanished. Some of it was spent clearly. Reynolds and Edwards lived for years on their shares, if not lavishly then comfortably, before the money ran out. Some was recovered in raids on suspects' homes and associates' properties. Some was handed back voluntarily, as in the case of Danny Pembroke, one of the 3 men never formally charged, who paid back £47,000 in a private arrangement with a detective. But the largest portion, the bulk of what was taken, has never been accounted for. It has been speculated about for 60 years. Some believe it was buried and never retrieved. Some believe it was laundered through criminal enterprises long since dissolved. Some believe that one or more of the three men who were never identified, the ones known only as number 1, number 2, and number 3, walked away with disproportionate shares and simply disappeared. Two of those three men were eventually identified decades later, Harry Smith and Danny Pembroke. Their identities were never made public at the time, and neither was ever charged. The third, number 3, was never identified. He remains to this day unknown. And then there is the Ulsterman. The man who started everything. The insider who told Gordon Goody and Buster Edwards about the bank holiday surplus. Who told them which train to watch, which carriage to target, which night to choose. Without his information, the Great Train Robbery is a plan that never leaves the pub table. Gordon Goody, who lived out his later years in Spain, giving interviews and eventually cooperating with a documentary about the robbery, claimed in his final years to know the Ulsterman's real name. He confirmed it in the documentary, reluctantly, speaking the name on camera after 50 years of silence. The name has been reported. It is common enough that it could not, on its own, identify anyone with certainty. The man it referred to, if he was ever the Ulsterman, would almost certainly be dead by now. We will probably never know for certain. And in a way that is appropriate, the Great Train Robbery began with a secret, and it ends with one. Bruce Reynolds was arrested in Torquay in November 1968. He pleaded guilty at his trial and was sentenced to 25 years. He served 10. He was released in 1978 and returned to a world that had changed enormously in his absence. The 1960s he had known, the swaggering, possibility-laden decade of the Great Caper, was long over. Punk rock had arrived and departed. The economy was different. London was different. Reynolds tried various legal ventures and found them uncongenial. By the 1980s, he had moved into drug trafficking, a part of his story that his admirers tend to skip quickly past, and served further time in prison. In later life, he wrote his autobiography, he gave interviews, he attended as best he could the funerals of the men he had assembled 40 years earlier. He spoke about the robbery with a mixture of pride and rue, pride at the planning, the execution, the scale of what had been achieved, rue at the aftermath, the fingerprints, the farm, the years behind bars. He called it, at various times, his Sistine Chapel, his masterpiece. By the 1990s, Reynolds was living on income support in a flat in Croydon, supplied by a charitable trust. The money, his share of £2.5 million, was gone, spent, seized, lost in the years of running and hiding. His wife Frances died in 2010. Bruce Reynolds died in his sleep on the 28th of February 2013. He was 81 years old. The date was not lost on people who had followed his story. The 28th of February 2013 was exactly 50 years, to the month, after Reynolds had begun his most serious planning for the robbery. He died on the anniversary, quietly in his sleep. As if even his ending had been planned. There is a question worth sitting with before we reach the end. Why did they become folk heroes? Not all criminals do. Most don't. Most are feared or pitied or simply ignored, their stories noted and filed and forgotten, but the Great Train Robbers became something else. Something that has persisted for 60 years, through films and books and documentaries and anniversary coverage in the newspapers. Part of it is the scale. £2.5 million in 1963 is a number so large, so almost abstract, that it tips over into something almost fictional. It doesn't feel like a real crime the way a mugging feels like a real crime. It feels like an event from a different category of existence. Part of it is the cleverness, the planning, the signal gantry, the batteries, the human chain, the 15 minutes. There is something in the human imagination that responds to extraordinary competence, regardless of what it is applied to. We admire craftsmanship even when the craft is theft. And part of it, perhaps the largest part, is timing. These men did what they did in the summer of 1963, at the exact moment when Britain was beginning to reassess its relationship with authority. The establishment had been shown to be fallible by the Profumo scandal. The deference that had governed British working-class life for generations was beginning slowly to fray. And here were a group of working-class men from South London who had looked at the most secure, most institutional, most establishment-adjacent cash delivery system in the country and had simply taken it. For people who had spent their lives being told that there were systems and rules and places, and that they should know their place within all of them, something about that was intoxicating. Even if they would never have done it themselves, even if they thought it was wrong, there was something in it. This is uncomfortable to say plainly, but it is honest. The folk hero status came at the expense of Jack Mills and David Whitby, and the 72 postal workers who lay on the floor of a carriage in the dark and did not know if they were going to be hurt. The folk hero status is built on real harm to real people, and this is worth remembering every time a film makes it look glamorous, every time a book lingers too long on the romance of the plan and not long enough on the man in the cab. History has a way of romanticizing boldness. It is one of history's less admirable habits. The robbers themselves, in their later years, were not uniform in how they spoke about what they had done. Some were defiant to the end. Some expressed regret for the violence, for the chaos, for the wasted years in prison, for the families that were fractured. Reynolds, in his memoir, was characteristically ambivalent, proud of the craft, rueful about the outcome, and careful to express regret about Mills specifically. Whether that regret was felt as deeply as it was expressed, only Reynolds knew. What is certain is that the money changed none of them in the way they had imagined it would. The men who kept their shares spent them. The men who went abroad found that exile is its own kind of imprisonment. The men who served their full sentences came out into a world that had moved on without them and found the return to ordinary life harder than the crime had ever been. The Great Train Robbery made 16 men briefly extraordinarily rich and ultimately made most of their lives worse. This is not a unique story in the history of crime, but it is, perhaps, a useful one. There is a version of the Great Train Robbery that is all caper. It is the version that made it into films and books and television dramas. The version with the clever men and the clever plan and the extraordinary execution. The version that dwells on the Monopoly board and the ketchup bottle and Ronnie Biggs living in Rio in the sun. The version that turns criminals into folk heroes and makes their story into entertainment. That version is not wrong exactly, but it leaves someone out. Jack Mills was born in 1905 in Crewe, the railway town, where an unusual proportion of the population worked on the railways because the railways were what Crewe was. He had driven trains for most of his working life. He knew his locomotives the way other men know the roads they drive every day, by feel, by habit, by the particular vibrations and sounds of a machine that had become almost an extension of himself. He was 57 years old on the night of August 8, 1963. He had not done anything remarkable. He had not made mistakes. He had stopped at the signal as the rules required. He had sent his co-driver to investigate. He had done what any careful, responsible driver would have done. And for this, for the simple act of being the man in the cab on that particular night, he was struck across the head with a blunt instrument hard enough to leave him semi-conscious, bleeding, barely able to see. He moved the train to the bridge because he had no choice. He cooperated because men in balaclavas told him what would happen if he didn't. When it was over, he sat in the cab with blood on his face and tried to understand what had just happened to his ordinary night. Jack Mills never fully recovered. He suffered headaches for the rest of his life, persistent, debilitating headaches that doctors attributed to the blow he had received. He returned to lighter duties with the railway, but never to the long-haul driving that had been his working life. The physical injury healed, more or less. The other kind did not. He died in 1970, at the age of 64. His family has always maintained, and the evidence supports them, that the attack on the night of August 8th contributed to his declining health. His co-driver, David Whitby, died in 1972, at 44, from a heart attack, young even by the standards of the time. At the trial, when the sentences were handed down, the judge cited the violence against Jack Mills as a significant factor in the severity of the terms. Reynolds was always at pains, in later interviews, to express regret about what had happened to Mills, to insist that the violence had not been planned, that it was the act of one man acting against instructions. This may be true. It does not change what happened to Jack Mills. History is very good at remembering the bold and the brazen. It is less reliable about the quiet people caught in the middle. The Great Train Robbery is remembered as a heist, a caper. An astonishing piece of criminal planning that came within a whisker of being the perfect crime. Jack Mills is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as a footnote. But in every story of audacity and cleverness, there is usually someone who simply had the bad luck to be in the wrong place. Someone who woke up that morning and went to work and did their job as they had always done it, and found themselves suddenly inside someone else's story, in a role they had never chosen, for which there was no way out except through. That was Jack Mills. And we should not forget him. The Great Train Robbery passed into legend almost immediately. There was something about it, the scale, the precision, the cast of characters, the extraordinary cat and mouse that followed, that the English imagination seized upon and has never quite let go. Films were made, books were written, documentaries, dramatizations. Reynolds and Edwards and Biggs became, in the popular imagination, a particular kind of figure, the charming rogue, the lovable criminal, the man who stuck it to the system and almost got away with it. It is easy to be seduced by that version. Harder, but more honest to hold both things at once, the genuine brilliance of the planning and the genuine harm of the execution, the extraordinary coordination of 16 men and the broken skull of one. The meticulous attention to every detail except the one that mattered, and the innocent man who paid the price for that detail. The money is still out there in some form, some of it at least, perhaps buried, perhaps long since spent. Perhaps in the hands of the children of men who were never named and never charged, and walked away from Bridego Bridge that August morning with fortunes they could never quite spend fast enough without being noticed. We don't know. We will probably never know. The signal at Sears Crossing was repaired. The railway line continues to carry trains south from Glasgow through the long, flat Buckinghamshire countryside, through Leighton Buzzard and past the bridge at Ledburn, past the embankment where the money was passed hand to hand in the darkness. The trains do not stop there now, unless the actual signals require it. Leatherslade Farm still exists, somewhat modified. The people who live in the area know the story. Some have known it all their lives. It is woven into the landscape the way certain events are, not on any official map, but present nonetheless, a ghost in the hedgerows. What is remarkable about the Great Train Robbery, 60 years on, is not its audacity. Audacious things happen every generation. What is remarkable is how completely it captured the imagination of a country, how it held up like a mirror, a version of Britain that was in the process of changing, that was saying goodbye to the old deference and the old institutions and the old certainties, and did not yet quite know what was coming next. The robbers were, in that sense, children of their time. Men who saw an opportunity and believed, for one extraordinary summer, that they were untouchable. They were not. But for 15 minutes under a stone bridge in Buckinghamshire, in the warm darkness of an August morning, with the money passing from hand to hand and the locomotive idling and the fields lying quiet on every side. For those 15 minutes, they were something remarkable. Something that Britain, for all its complicated feelings about it, has never quite been able to stop talking about. Sleep well. This has been Soft Echoes of History. If this story found you in the right moment, if it gave you something to rest in, something to carry quietly into sleep, then it did what it was made to do. The subscribe button is just below.